The water is 54 degrees, a temperature that doesn't just feel cold. It feels like a physical assault. 17-year-old George Morgan is neck deep in the English Channel, and his body is already beginning to shut down. Around him, the air is thick with a metallic tang of cordite and the nauseating smell of diesel fuel from thousands of ships churning the Atlantic into a gray, frothing soup. George isn't carrying a rifle. He isn't wearing a steel helmet. He's dressed in a pair of sneakers, a light jacket, and a life belt. His hands, blue and trembling, fumble with a block of C3 plastic explosive. It feels cold like modeling clay, but it has the power to level a bridge. Behind him, the first wave of the invasion is hitting the sand, and the screams of the men are lost in the roar of the German 88mm shells. Ahead of George stands a Belgian gate, a 10-foot-tall, 3-ton steel frame rigged with a teller mine. If George doesn't wire his charges quickly, the tide will rise, hiding the mine beneath the surf. The incoming landing craft filled with hundreds of American soldiers will hit it blindly. The boats will be shredded. The men will drown in the blood-stained surf. George looks up. A sniper's bullet snaps past his ear, hitting the steel frame with a sharp ping. He doesn't duck. He can't. He has a job to do, and the clock is ticking toward a disaster only he can stop. Welcome to World War II Obscura. When we picture D-Day, we see the images from Saving Private Ryan, the ramps dropping, the infantry rushing the bluffs, the carnage on the sand. There's a group of men whose story is rarely told, men who arrived at the beachhead before the infantry, and who stayed in the water while everyone else was running for cover. They were the Naval Combat Demolition Units, or NCDUs. Their mission was so dangerous that the Navy's top brass quietly referred to it as the suicide problem. Hitler had turned the coast of France into an impenetrable fortress, not just with bunkers and guns, but with millions of underwater obstacles designed to tear the hulls out of any ship that dared to approach. To solve this, the Navy didn't look for seasoned commandos. They looked for swimmers. They looked for lifeguards. They looked for boys like George Morgan, a teenager from New Jersey who had spent his summers watching the waves, never imagining he would one day be tasked with dismantling the Atlantic Wall by hand. Today we know their successors as the Navy SEALs, one of the most elite fighting forces on the planet. But in 1944 they were an experiment. They were the naked warriors operating with no armor, no support, and no room for error. Their story is one of impossible pressure, where a single mistake with a fuse could be the end of an entire invasion force. This is the story how a handful of divers imposed order on the chaos of the most important day in history, and how they survived a transition from freezing Atlantic to the shark-infested reefs of the Pacific. Like so many before him, George Morgan was a child of the Great Depression, growing up in a house where every penny was a victory. As a young boy, he sold magazines for 35 cents a month. He fetched foul balls at minor league baseball games for a quarter apiece. This wasn't pocket money. It was survival money, handed directly to his parents to buy pork chops, 2 for a nickel. George was a natural athlete. He had a pitcher's arm so accurate that he caught the eye of the Brooklyn Dodgers. He was offered a spot in their farm system, the dream of every kid in Jersey. But the world was on fire. In 1943, George stood before a Navy recruiter. He was only 17, but he was wiry, tough, and he knew the water. He had just been a lifeguard, earning $20, working 80 hours a week. When the Navy asked if he could swim, he made what he later called the biggest mistake of my life. He said, "Hell yes." Within weeks, he found himself at Fort Pierce, Florida. This wasn't a standardized training camp. It was the Indoctrination School, run by a man named Draper Kaufman. Kaufman was a legend in his own right. The son of an admiral, he'd been denied a Navy commission before because of his poor eyesight. Undeterred, he'd gone to Europe as an ambulance driver, been captured by the Nazis, released, joined the Royal Navy, and learned the terrifying art of bomb disposal during the London Blitz. Kaufman's training program was designed to break men. He believed that if you were going to handle explosives in the middle of a battle, your body had to be able to function when your mind was screaming at you to quit. George and his teammates were subjected to what would later become Hell Week. They spent hours submerged in the mosquito-infested Florida swamps. They were marched until their feet bled. And then there were the concussions. Instructors would set off TNT charges just yards away from the recruits while they were still in the water. The shock wave would hit your chest like a sledgehammer, rattle your teeth, and leave your ears ringing for days. This was the crucible. They learned to handle C3 explosive, a stable putty-like substance that smelled vaguely of almonds. They practiced wiring tattletale cords, long detonating fuses that had to be synchronized perfectly. If one man's charges went off before the others, the blast would travel through the water and kill every other diver in the vicinity. There was no margin for error. You learned to trust the man next to you with your life because you were literally holding the fuse to his. By June of 1944, George Morgan was no longer a teenager from Jersey. He was a demolition expert. He was assigned to NCDU 22. On the morning of June 6th, he stood on the deck of a transport ship looking out at the coastline of Normandy. The naval bombardment was supposed to have neutralized the German defenses, but as the sun began to rise through a thick shroud of smoke and mist, it became clear that the Atlantic wall was very much alive. The plan was for the NCDUs to hit the beach early, at H-hour minus 30 minutes. They were supposed to have a window of low tide to clear 16 50-yard wide gaps in the obstacles. Each gap had to be perfectly clear to allow the LCTs, massive tank-carrying landing craft, to reach the sand. As George's rubber boat hit the water, the chaos began. The current was much stronger than anticipated, dragging the divers miles away from their assigned sectors. The smoke from the burning ships was so thick that visibility was down to a few yards. George rolled into the water. The weight of the explosive strapped to his body and rubber bladders threatened to pull him all the way under. He felt the jagged, cold steel of a hedgehog scrape against his leg. These were 3 steel beams bolted together, designed to gut a boat. He swam to the first one, his fingers numb. The air was a cacophony of sound, the deep thump of the 88s, the staccato rip of MG-42 machine guns, and the splashing of bullets in the water. George saw a landing craft hit a mine just 50 yards away. The explosion was so violent it sent a wall of water over him, filled with metal fragments and pieces of wood. George was working on a Belgian gate, a massive steel frame, when he noticed a group of American infantrymen from the 1st Division. They were terrified, huddled beneath the obstacles for cover from the machine gun fire. George faced a horrific moral choice. He was there to blow these obstacles up. If he didn't, the next wave of boats would be destroyed. If he did, he might kill the very men he was trying to save. He didn't hesitate. He stood straight up in the surf, a perfect target for every German gunner on the beach, and began screaming at the soldiers, "Move! Get away from the steel! It's going up!" He physically grabbed the men by their collars, hauling them through the water, forcing them toward the relative safety of the seawall. Once the air was clear, George returned to the gate. He wired the tattletale cord, checking the connections with his shaking hands. He signaled his team, "Fire in the hole!" When the charges blew, the concussion was unlike anything in training. Because the water was shallow, the blast wave didn't just hit George, it lifted him. He felt his ribs compress and the air driven from his lungs. For a moment he was underwater. The world is silent, swirling mess of sand and blood. When he surfaced, the Belgian gate was gone. A gap had been opened. The carnage at Omaha Beach was absolute. Out of 175 NCDU divers who went into the water that morning, 31 were killed and 60 were wounded, a casualty rate of over 50%. Many of George's friends simply disappeared. When an explosive charge is hit by an enemy shell, there's nothing left to bury. George spent the rest of the day in the water, dragging bodies out of the surf and trying to clear more paths. He saw things that would haunt him for the next 80 years. He saw men he had trained with, men who he'd shared jokes in the tents at Fort Pierce with, floating face down in the shallow water. But their mission had succeeded. Of the 16 planned gaps, 13 had been opened. It was through these narrow corridors that the tanks and reinforcements finally reached the shore. Without those 13 gaps, Omaha Beach would likely have been a total disaster, and the entire D-Day invasion might have failed. But for George Morgan, there was no victory parade. He was shipped back to England, his body battered and his mind filled with the demons of Omaha. He expected to be sent home. He was a still 17-year-old who had done more than enough. The government knew better. Instead, he received new orders. He was going to the Pacific. The transition was jarring. The Atlantic was gray, cold, and brutal. The Pacific was clear, warm, and beautiful, but it was far more deadly. The Navy realized that the demolition units needed to be more than just blow-it-up teams. They needed to be scouts. They needed to know what was under the water before the Marines ever left their ships. This was the birth of the underwater demolition teams, or UDTs. They were given new equipment, swim fins developed by an eccentric inventor, dive masks, and a knife. They were told to shed their jackets and sneakers. They would swim into the enemy territory wearing nothing but their trunks. They became the naked warriors. In the Pacific, the stakes shifted from brute force to stealth. George Morgan found himself on the black sand beaches of Iwo Jima and the coral reefs of Okinawa. The Japanese knew what happened at Normandy. They studied it. They knew the Americans would try to clear the beaches, so they changed their tactics. They didn't just build obstacles, they built traps. At Okinawa, George was part of a reconnaissance mission. The water was so clear you could see 30 feet down, but that clarity was a double-edged sword. It meant the Japanese snipers on the cliffs could see the divers just as clearly as the divers could see the reef. George describes the surreal experience of painting himself for a mission. He would smear his body in dark grease, partly for camouflage and partly to protect against the stinging jellyfish and biting cold of the deeper currents. He spit into his mask to keep it from fogging, a trick he and his teammates pioneered. He swam towards the shore. The silence of the underwater world was broken by the rhythmic thump of the explosions. But there was something else. Below him, hidden in the underwater foxholes carved into the coral, were the fukiuru, or crouching dragons. These were Japanese suicide divers. They wore heavy diving suits and carried long bamboo poles tipped with contact mines. Their mission was to wait until an American boat passed overhead, then thrust the pole upward, destroying the boat and killing themselves. Imagine George Morgan, now 19 years old, floating in the crystal clear water of the East China Sea. He looks down and sees a human being staring back at him from the seafloor holding a bomb. There was a war of nerves. George had to swim over these hidden killers, marking the safe channels with buoys, all while knowing that a single movement could trigger a blast that would vaporize him instantly. The UDTs were the first Americans to step onto Iwo Jima. They swam to the shore under a hail of mortar fire to take sand samples, ensuring that the tanks wouldn't get bogged down. They were the ones who discovered that the Japanese had built a massive network of tunnels leading right to the water's edge. George recalled the physical toll of these dives. Without modern regulators, they had to dive deep and fast to avoid fire. The pressure changes were brutal. George once surfaced with blood pouring from his nose and ears, the result of a ruptured eardrum. He had to keep swimming. There was no one to replace him. The emotional through line for these men was the question George asked himself every night: will I live to see the sunrise? In the Atlantic, the danger was cold and steel. In the Pacific, the danger was the fanatical commitment of an enemy who was willing to hide in the sand and wait for you. By the time Japan surrendered in Tokyo Bay, George Morgan had been at war for nearly 2 years. He'd seen the start of the liberation of Europe and the final moments of the war in the East, and he was still only 19 years old. When he returned home to New Jersey, the naked warriors were ordered into a media blackout. The Navy didn't want the world to know how they cleared the beaches. They didn't want the techniques of underwater demolition to become public knowledge. So George went back to his life. He worked, he raised a family, and for decades he didn't say a word about what he had done. The NCDUs and UDTs eventually evolved. In 1962, President John F. Kennedy officially established the Navy SEALs, drawing directly from the traditions, the training, and the men of the UDTs. The Hell Week that modern SEALs endure is a direct descendant of the Indoctrination School from Fort Pierce, Florida. The fins, the mask, the naked warrior spirit, it all started with George and his teammates. So why does this story matter? Well, because it challenges our understanding of what makes a hero. We often look for the man with the gun, the general with the map, but the victory at Normandy and the success of the island hopping campaign rested on the shoulders of teenagers who were willing to swim into the mouth of the dragon with nothing but a knife and a block of explosives. George Morgan didn't just blow up obstacles. He imposed the human will under the chaotic forces of war. He saved thousands of lives by standing in the surf when everyone else was hiding. He reminds us that history isn't just made of grand movements. It's made of small, terrifying decisions made by individuals in the dark. George lived to be 95 years old, one of the last living links to a unit that changed the world from beneath the waves. His legacy isn't written in the history books as often as it should be, but it is written with every beachhead that was successfully taken and every soldier who made it home because the path was clear. If you want to see more forgotten stories, hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment with a person or mission you think we should cover. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is larger than we could ever imagine.